So please give a good welcome to Professor Mike Hardy.
So this is a great title. One of my graduate students came up with this. What could you do at 4 o'clock after a very long day? But I will be able to tell her on Monday that the energy levels are incredible. You are amazing people. And just listening to the last presentation is humbling. We questioned during the day this interface between peace and the traumas of health and the struggles with health in many parts of the world. And none of us are left in any doubt of the relationship when you hear stories that we have today. And I'm really pleased that much of the work we're doing at Coventry Universities resonates strongly with the dialogue and discussions that we've had today. Peace doesn't stand on its own, we've said, and we've reaffirmed that. We need to invest in education of our young people, and we've reaffirmed that. We've met and heard from some of the Rotary Peace Fellows. Astonishing, and congratulations to you. You have my real congratulations for the work that you're doing and for the movement that Rotary has sponsored. I've learned a great deal. But I wanted to sum the sort of ideas and thinking that we introduced in my centre at Coventry. It's a new centre in the global infrastructure of peace studies. Coventry, no one ever doubts, is an iconic city for peace and reconciliation. And the experience of the war, its traumas, and the way in which Coventrians grew out of that with its global network. The most twinned city in the world, and twinned for reasons of peace and reconciliation. It's an astonishing legacy. When I was first invited to come to the university, it was our Vice-Chancellor's passion to reflect in the work with our young people. We have 30,000 students on campus now, and another brilliant university just up the road. And are we keeping up with the potential of this iconic city? Are we contributing in the way that we should? So we formed my centre. Not my centre, it's the centre of the university I'm privileged to lead at the moment. And we wanted to cast it not in the tradition of peace as an alternative to conflict. And hasn't that been a theme that's come up in our discussions today? Peace is much bigger than simply an absence of conflict. It's a much bigger thing than simply something you impose on disorder. I'm a believer from my research that we're peaceful people, that the nurture-nature issue, and it's highly controversial and it's discussed often. I don't think we're created as conflict-focused. I think we're created peacefully. Something happens. Something happens in the way we coexist. So we wanted to build a centre which enabled much more deep study of peace in the context of two things that mattered to us. That is trust, the relationships that people have one to another through the lens of trust, and the other was social relations. Because basically my colleagues and I believe that the answers here are about the way we relate one to another at the highest level. Let me explore that a little more. So I'm going to do three things. You notice that in my work I've replaced focus on peace, which is a state of affairs. We've discussed it being a journey, a destination, to this notion of peacefulness, which I think is really important. And that is what my personal research and the research of many of my colleagues in the centre. We're 65 academics now, 80 graduate students, 60 of them doing PhDs. It's a very significant centre. And we're released from the burdens of undergraduate teachings to focus on research. We're working currently in 61 countries. We only have a small office because few of my colleagues are here. They come every now and then. But the three things I wanted to talk briefly about were, firstly, I wanted to explore a little bit more with you, something we've already discussed and almost resolved today, about what we mean by peacefulness. What's he getting at? Why is he changing the language? And two and three, what do we do about it? I was hugely impressed when I visited President Carter's center in Atlanta. over his study, President Carter does amazing things since he left the White House. And over his door, his study, he has this sign, Waging Peace, which I really liked. And it's stayed with me ever since. And essentially it allows us to unlock the things you need to do in parallel to what do you do when you wage war? You know, you have a plan, you sit down. But waging peace, what do we need to do to achieve it, to win it, to move relationships in our troubled world in a different direction? And I talk about confronting our demons, that there are things happening we need to manage better. And thirdly, if you really want peace, there are things we can do to set the conditions where peace and peacefulness is more likely. Pretty ambitious for 15 minutes, but I'll do my best. One of the things that's changed in the academy over the last couple of decades is a change in the primary focus of our research and our understanding of peacefulness, away from peace and security in terms of relationships between states and communities and even places, to place the individual much more at the center of our study. And I think that's been helpful to our overall understanding. Interesting, some research that I did in 2012 asked the question of many people about where they felt the most insecurity came from. And it wasn't wars and pestilence, and it wasn't mega things, mega trends. It was actually mostly worries about everyday life, rather than the dread of cataclysmic world events. So clearly the media helps us to think that the existential threat facing us are big things. You remember H.G. Wells and The War of the Worlds. You know, we were at war with each other until this huge mega threat came from the Martians. But actually the research shows differently, that most people feel their sense of insecurity from issues about everyday life. If that's the case, we should study more about what we can do to set the conditions, as I shall come on to say. So in thinking about waging peace, and in thinking about redefining peacefulness as my driver, I looked at the notion that at the World Economic Forum every year, they study what are the big existential threats facing the world. At Davos, the world's leading business and politicians meet to analyze in a very intense discussion last week of January. Their conclusion in the last 2 years has been very clear, that the biggest threats to us, the biggest big problems that we face, are a world characterized by deepening inequality, a world characterized by persistent, sticky growth, and jobless growth in particular, a world characterized by an absence of really, really charismatic and passionate and purposeful leadership in all the quarters. There are plenty of good examples. It's whether the generality, and a weakening of democracy in the world generally. So those are what we call wicked problems, because they're super complex when put together. You can solve one of them, and by approaching one of the problems, you can intensify the impact of another. In our particular study, once you focus on individuals, we've also reinforced our own concern about this generation of young people and their preparation for responsibility, or they're taking responsibility. And the studies that have been done recently on why youth is so vulnerable, and we see the consequences of vulnerability throughout the world, are really quite interesting. And they're about how young people feel in the context of current social relations, a degree of humiliation and an absence of dignity. In many parts of the world, it is that which drives their concern and sometimes their anger. Many young people tell us in focus groups about how they experience and watch and observe social injustice over many periods of years. It doesn't seem to worry the generation that currently has control. And that they feel there's a lack of system, a lack of voice that can be heard, and a process for open and transparent resolutions. So at the sharp end of vulnerable youth, the research is very clear that those who do stray from a peaceful world, those who are provoked and attracted to a violent context, tend to be because they feel a sense of humiliation, of absence of dignity, of social injustice that doesn't seem to matter to people, and a lack of transparent systems for resolution. So if we're going to wage against those wicked problems and against some of the findings we know that are affecting individuals, what do we have to do if we want peace? And this is a lovely cartoon that came from a cartoonist that joined us for our Rising Peace Festival, who drew things as people were talking, and it was inspiring. But if we want peace seriously, there are things that we can do to make it more likely. And this we've been working on. I'm particularly concerned. Worrying about the world without having potential things that can be done positively is a bit nugatory of thought. The first, and I heard it today, there's 7 points I'd just like to share with you. Let's begin with ourselves. Let's not end with ourselves, but let's begin with ourselves. Peacefulness is very much about how you approach relationships in your world. A couple of years ago, someone was in fact it was my son, was saying, "Mike, what's your New Year's resolution?" I said, "Well, I don't really do those." But he said to me, and it was very insightful, he's a computer analyst, but he does actually think at the same time, so that's good. He said, "Mike, why don't you keep talking about this all the time, why don't you give up anger?" That was the thought. So I went away and thought about it, and we tried, and I did. And it's an amazingly powerful thing, and that is a sense that Mandela gave us, that Tutu has given us, this notion of starting from within. So I'm still hugely disappointed about things, but my staff will reinforce, you will rarely see me angry. I'm not perfect, and I fail. And you start with yourself. Secondly, we've heard also today a lot about some sacred values that matter to us. You know, the freedom from fear, the freedom from want, the freedom to live in dignity. These are things that are not negotiable. These are not to be debated. These are our sacred values, and they matter. And they should be part and parcel of the conditions that we require in order to be peaceful. I think also research has shown that everyday peacefulness is hugely important. It's not just the issues of the big conflicts in the world. Everyday peacefulness matters, and that means we must talk and listen. And one of us said earlier, the power of listening and the power of amplifying voice is important, and that's everyday peacefulness. That's how we treat each other, whether we're strangers or friends. More research has gone on to show the power of mobilizing women. That's hugely important. Women are shown in our research, in the academy. They're more likely to develop peacefulness than men. There's all sorts of reasons for that, and I have too little time to explore that more. Then there's peaceful institutions. Why is it that we don't automatically, by default, create peaceful institutions? It's very interesting. I travel a lot with my work. I have yet to find a ministry of peace. There's plenty of ministries of defense, a ministry of war, a ministry of everything else. Why don't we organize ourselves around a minister of peace? I think that would help. Why don't we point our economics and economic skills at peacefulness instead of at business success? Peace economics, there's a couple of simple wins. If we moved to a basic income, which many have said, why don't we create a world in which there is basic income, that people have the minimum that's required to get by, no longer just about managing, but actually managing, that they can focus on other things. And at the same time, why doesn't industry establish its practices of do no harm? So it invests in its profit, in its bottom line, but is driven by a notion of do no harm to someone else. We need a media for peace. I was sharing the work we did for UNESCO earlier last year. There is more peace in the world now than at any time in the history of mankind. We don't feel that because the media tells us that we're in a terribly conflicted world. We tend not to have a media that describes good news. We have one that prefers bad news. And finally, we don't spend sufficient time, and again we talked about this earlier, in discussing peacefulness in education. Do we prepare our young people? Do we have curriculum in the school which values peacefulness as an important part of our social cohesion? Some of those are pie-in-the-sky wish lists, you'll say. But they're things that define the research that we're doing, to try and find a lever, trying to find an edge that will help us push towards that notion. So to conclude, I believe that peacefulness can be achieved and can be retained and sustained. But there's a set of relationships which appear to me to be important and to focus on. Firstly, I'd like to create a world. I don't know how we do this together, but by goodness, if you can do what you've done for polio, you can do it for this. Can we find a way of creating the context where young people were at ease with themselves? Magnus reminded us earlier, those of you who enjoyed his input, of the trauma of some of the contexts in which our young people find themselves in. That's not acceptable. So let's find a way of creating young people at ease with themselves. Let's find a way of building neighborhoods that are self-reinforcing, that are resilient, that can cope with the inevitable change. Just after the Second World War and the experience that was described in the Coventry story, Popper was writing about the constant strains of society. These aren't going to go away. There are going to be shocks that hit us. There are going to be things that happen. We have to grow a resilience to deal with that in a peaceful way, as opposed to one which resorts to violent rejection. And finally, we need public services to work in full partnership with ordinary people. They need to be responsive. We have amazing public services in our nation, in the United Kingdom, and amazing public services in many countries. But this isn't consistent. And sometimes public services are unable, because of fiscal and economic traumas, to keep up and be as responsive as we know. This is a partnership, in other words. So a set of relationships we need. Young people working together, neighborhoods binding together, and governments working in collaboration with people. And to create the peaceful relationships that those conditions might enable, we need to support progressive forces. We need to actively go out and say, this is a good thing. It meets the challenges of our sacred values. It removes fear from the lives of many people. So it's a good thing. Let's support it. Let's deal also with the drivers of challenge. If we have poverty, we need to deal with poverty. If we have knife crimes in London, we need to deal with it. We need to examine, research, and provide evidence about the drivers of challenge and resolve them. We can't paper over the cracks. It's actually the fundamentals that matter in peacefulness. We need to protect human rights. Several of you talked about that earlier today. I've had an amazing day meeting many of you. I'm not a Rotarian yet, he says, but I am really encouraged by the genuineness and the purposefulness of the discussions that you've had today, and I'm delighted you invited me to come. And finally, we should cultivate peace in everyday life. It's not a special case. We shouldn't just go to the Palestinian territories or to Somalia. We do that to Afghanistan.